Let's just jump right into it. Set the scene in your mind. The year is 1607. A tiny group of English ships is slowly creeping toward the rugged, completely unfamiliar coast of Virginia. The men on board, they're exhausted, they're uncertain, and they're staring out at this vast wilderness. Now, historians tell us that what they eventually built there became the first permanent English colony in America. But as you're about to see, this whole venture literally almost didn't make it out of the gate.
I want you to really ask yourself, would you survive 1607? Just imagine stepping off that ship right onto the muddy banks of the James River. You've been traveling for months, you have barely any supplies, absolutely zero wilderness survival skills, and you're walking into an environment you know nothing about. We have this habit of thinking about historical events as these guaranteed set-in-stone victories. But back in 1607, survival was absolutely not guaranteed. Actually, the odds were stacked ridiculously high against these early settlers from the very second their boots hit the ground.
Okay, let's dive into this, because we really need to clear up a massive historical myth right away. When we think about early American colonists, our brains usually go straight to the Pilgrims in 1620, right? The whole journey for religious freedom. But Jamestown was a totally different animal. When this settlement was founded on May 14, 1607, and named after King James I, it was definitely not a religious mission. Jamestown was essentially a corporate business venture. Most of the guys there were looking for profit, not a permanent new home. They were just there to do a job.
So you might be wondering who was actually signing their paychecks. That would be the Virginia Company, a business based thousands of miles away over in London. They had three very strict corporate goals for this incredibly wild terrain. 1. Make money for the investors by finding gold. 2. Establish trade networks. And 3. Claim land in North America for England. The roughly 104 men and boys who landed there were basically just pawns in a super risky business experiment. There's honestly a pretty dark irony in a bunch of London businessmen trying to run a wilderness survival camp from a cozy office across the ocean. And unfortunately, for the guys actually on the ground, the Virginia wilderness did not care one bit about their corporate objectives. The brutal reality of the situation set in almost instantly. Historical records show us that the colony's first few years were just agonizingly hard. First off, these settlers had the incredibly bad luck of arriving right in the middle of a serious drought. So the environment itself was actively working against them. But to make matters even worse, a lot of these men were quote-unquote gentlemen, meaning they had literally never done a day of hard manual labor in their entire lives. They were eagerly looking around for gold, they definitely weren't looking to plant crops, and when you combine a severe drought with a startled group of guys who quite frankly don't even know how to hold a plow, your food supplies are going to vanish very, very quickly. Look at that number, 60. That number represents one of the absolute darkest chapters in early American history. By the winter of 1609 to 1610, the colony entered this horrific period that we now call the starving time. According to historical accounts, out of the roughly 500 colonists living at Jamestown when that winter started, only about 60 of them survived to see the spring. Disease and just intense hunger completely decimated the population. Driven to absolute desperation, these colonists resorted to eating roots, shoe leather, and honestly sometimes even worse, just to stay alive. They were literally dying by the hundreds.
Now, obviously, the colonists weren't alone out there. Jamestown was built directly on the land of the Powhatan Confederacy, which was a very powerful indigenous nation. And historians always point out that the relationship between the colonists and the Powhatan was incredibly complex. It was this intense, dual-nature dynamic. On one hand, the Powhatan traded vital food to the struggling settlers, which absolutely saved their lives. But on the other hand, you had deep cultural friction, constant misunderstandings, and settlers aggressively expanding their footprint, which sparked periods of really intense tension and violent conflict on both sides.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because it really maps out how quickly the stakes escalated. We start with that hopeful arrival in 1607, plunge straight into the absolute devastation of the starving time in 1609 and 10, catch a brief gasp of air with a temporary peace in 1614, and then finally arrive at 1619. And 1619 is a year that cemented a dual legacy for the entire future of the nation. It's a true survival epic, and it escalates year by brutal year.
So how on earth did they eventually pull out of this nosedive? Well, historians point to three very specific solutions. First, a colonist named John Smith stepped up with a really harsh but completely necessary rule. He basically said, if you don't work, you don't eat. It was a massive reality check for all those gentlemen expecting an easy payday. Second, Smith aggressively negotiated with the Powhatan for food. But the third step is the one that really ensured their long-term survival. A settler named John Rolfe figured out how to grow a specific type of sweet tobacco that happened to be highly profitable back in England.
By the 1610s, this tobacco spread like wildfire, became Jamestown's main export, and finally gave this whole risky business venture a real economic reason to keep going.
John Rolfe is actually famous for a lot more than just tobacco, though. In 1614, Rolfe married Pocahontas, the daughter of the powerful Powhatan leader, Chief Powhatan. According to historians, this marriage was a massive diplomatic moment. It actually managed to create a much-needed, though definitely temporary, period of peace between the exhausted colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. And that brief pause in the fighting gave Jamestown the breathing room it so desperately needed to focus on its new cash crop, tobacco, and finally stabilize the whole business operation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the year 1619 brought this monumental shift in how these people were actually governed. It marked the creation of the House of Burgesses in Jamestown. This was the very first representative government assembly in English North America. It's a truly uplifting milestone, really. It was an early step toward the exact kind of representative democracy that would later become the foundation of the United States government. It showed that the colony was finally maturing beyond just being a simple corporate outpost and turning into a functioning society. However, that exact same year brought another milestone to Jamestown, one of profound tragedy. Historical records show that in 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in English North America. They were brought there entirely against their will. This specific moment marked the dark beginning of what would ultimately become the system of chattel slavery in the American colonies. It was a brutal practice that would expand significantly over the next 2 centuries and leave a deep, incredibly painful scar on the nation's history. When we look at all these facts together, we start to see that America's founding just wasn't this single, simple, triumphant event. It was a really complex web. It was a foundation built entirely on contradictions. On one hand, you have this incredible human struggle and improbable survival. You have the inspiring early seeds of representative democracy starting to take root. And yet, sitting right beside it, in the exact same time and place, you have the tragic, cruel origins of colonial slavery. Jamestown really is a microcosm of all these powerful forces colliding at once.
So, I want to leave you with this thought to ponder for a bit. Can we truly understand America's founding without embracing its deepest contradictions? Jamestown shows us that history is rarely just one thing. It's this tangled, messy story of cooperation, conflict, innovation, and tragedy. Thank you so much for hanging out with me to explore this incredible slice of history. If this sparked your curiosity, you absolutely won't want to miss our next explainer, where we're going to keep unraveling the fascinating, complex layers of our past. I'll see you then.